I'm Sarah Butcher. Welcome back to the Side Comment. The Somers affair is unquestionably the greatest scandal in the history of the U.S. Navy and is a story that has been told a number of times before, including in Herman Melville's classic story Billy Budd. James Delgado, author of The Curse of the Somers, the secret history behind the U.S. Navy's most infamous mutiny, joins us today to talk about why the story of the Somers continues to grip us and how national tensions of the post-revolutionary era offer a mirror to our contemporary age.
Hi, I'm James Delgado. I'm a maritime archaeologist, maritime historian, occasional storyteller, and with that, what I like to talk about most are tales of the sea, tales of shipwrecks, tales of what those wrecks mean, the stories they have, and how they connect not only to the past, but also connect us in the present day, not only to those events, but also remind us that that which is past is prologue. We often relive our history. I talk about this particularly now in my new book, The Curse of the Somers, the secret history behind the U.S. Navy's most infamous mutiny. I say that with a reminder that when you really get into it and dig deeper into the story, no pun intended, what we see here is that there are aspects of the story that were perhaps secret. There were aspects of the story that just simply weren't talked about amongst polite society in those days. And as well, the question of whether it was a mutiny is one of the biggest controversies of all. Was it mutiny or was it murder? What makes this story all the more fascinating is that, like all great tales, it has those who tell it in different ways. There have been a number of books in the past that have spoken about the Somers and the Somers mutiny. And there have also been some amazing riffs on that theme, if you will, both in popular art. I mean, Currier and Ives published a broadside illustration showing three bodies hanging from the yards. A shocking event. Never before in the history of the U.S. Navy had they ever done such a thing. But then again, never before had they had a mutiny like this, or so they said. And then you also have an amazing, absolutely powerful book published years later, small, but penned by Herman Melville, one of America's great 19th century writers, best known, of course, for Moby Dick, but other stories. His Billy Budd, a tale of a young lad, an innocent lad who is unfairly and unjustly hung due to the rules of war, thanks to an officer who dislikes him and a captain who's bound by duty, remains the most powerful connection I think we have to the story of the Somers, because Melville was inspired by the events that took place on that Navy brig on the 1st of December, 1842. But as to whether or not he got the story right still remains also a topic of discussion, if not controversy. For me, what I so like about it is not only is it a take on the story. I mean, like all good stories, you have to dig into the nuances. And in this, Melville digs into this idea of a young lad, of the rigidity of a naval system, a number of things that I think, certainly for many folks would say, wow, this must be what it's like to be caught up in something bigger than yourself. Or wow, this is what it's like when you get dragged into a system. Or wow, this is what it's like when you are put into a situation where you get the wrong person on a small, crowded ship, and then all hell breaks loose. But back to Billy Budd and why I like that story as an archaeologist. I became interested in the Somers Affair, as it was known, not because I'd read it as a historian, but because I'd been invited to join a series of dives off the coast of Veracruz, Mexico, to take a look at a wreck suspected to be the long lost but never really forgotten Somers. My good friend George Belcher, art dealer, explorer, archaeologist by not profession, but by desire and wanting to really connect to that part of the world, invited me down to take a look as a then National Park Service U.S. government archaeologist, because the wreck, if found, would be very important both to the United States and to Mexico, where the wreck lay, having been lost in the war between the United States and Mexico in 1846. As I dived down there, and as it became clear that what we were doing was actually diving on Somers itself, this very famous, this very notorious ship, I thought about the last lines of Melville's poem that closes out Billy Budd. And here you have this lad, locked up down below with darbies or handcuffs on his wrists, about to be taken up on deck, a hood put over his head, a noose set around his neck, and then hauled to the top, kicking and struggling to die. and then to be taken down, sewn into that hammock, with the last bit of that needle with that thick thread going right through his nose to make sure that he's truly dead, and then to be dropped into the deep. And so, with that, thinking of that and the inevitability of Billy Budd, as well as the three mutineers on the Somers, Spencer, Cromwell, Small were their names, the thought of Billy himself, all of that, swimming through a wreck that was dark and with weeds and marine growth all around it, I thought of that line, those lines. Heaven knows who will have the running of me up. No pipe to those halyards, but aren't it all sham? A blur's in my eyes. It is dreaming that I am. A hatchet to my hawser, all adrift to go, the drum roll to grog and Billy never know. But Donald, he has promised to stand by the plank, so I'll shake a friendly hand ere I sink. But no, it is dead then I'll be, come to think. I remember Taff the Welshman when he sank, and his cheek, it was like the budding pink. But me, the lash and hammock, drop me deep. Fathoms down, how I'll dream fast asleep. I feel it stealing now. Sentry, are you there? Just ease these darbies at the wrist and roll me over fair. I'm sleepy, and the oozy weeds about me twist. A powerful poem, a powerful story. And Billy Budd is the way that most people know about the Somers. But let's go back to 1842. The country is very much like the United States today. It's growing. It has growing pains. There are various movements afoot in which people are arguing about what it means to be an American, the question of religion, the role of religion in politics, the role of secret cabals that are plotting to overturn and change things. Among them, a group known as the Masons, and in that, crusading lawyer who fights the Masonic forces, which, by the way, included a number of the founding fathers. But nonetheless, he fights those Masons as part of this anti Masonic sentiment, and it is his son who will end up being the leader of quote unquote the mutineers on the Somers. His name is John Canfield Spencer, and he plays an important role in this story because he is not only a prominent person, he is the Secretary of War, serving in the cabinet of the President of the United States, who has come to power because his predecessor, William Henry Harrison, has died. His accidency, John Tyler, as he was termed by members of Congress, is not a popular man in the Oval Office. And indeed, he will spar with his cabinet and fight with them and come very close to impeachment. Sound familiar? Well, in the midst of all of this, and with a massive amount of homelessness in New York in particular, and with the Navy finding that it needs more sailors as it continues to build up and grow, as it's getting stronger and bigger, largely as a result of the presidency of Andrew Jackson and Jackson's desire to build up the American military. You need more officers, you need more crew. But in this, what you also have are a series of social movements which are challenging America because there's a talk about more religion in public life. There's the need for a variety of changes in how we conduct our life. This is a time in which social movements spring up to deal with equal rights, rights for women, temperance, anti-alcohol, and of course, then a variety of religious sects that come into being with arguments over what really constitutes the right faith, even an assault on a Catholic nunnery and a girls' school, burning it to the ground just outside of Boston, for example. All signs that, everything is not quite right in the American body politic, but certainly it's not always right, too, on the streets of New York, where these boys, who are reflectively known to social reformers as the sweepings of the street, are living out a miserable existence throughout the 1830s and into the early 1840s. What also is coming, of course, very much into the fore of the entire story is the fact that America is going through a grinding economic depression, and that creates its own problems. With that, here's the Navy. They're building more ships. They need more crew. The men that they're putting on these ships and the boys that were also joining to serve, because yes, in those days, boys did serve in the Navy. Underage boys, there were ranks for them. A ship's boy was actually a rank. And so with this, you have this happening. And what you also have then is something else that drives the social reformers insane. It is the thought that basically ships are very much like a floating prison. And for a young boy to be on board one of these ships, particularly amongst jaded sailors who drink, who are actually given a ration of grog or alcohol to help get them through their day as sailors, well, all sorts of things are happening. So what does one do? Well, this is why the Somers actually comes into the story powerfully, because the Somers, along with its sister brig, a small, fast two-masted ship built for speed, tiny, cramped, but an effective and powerful little force, even with just 10 guns, to dart in and out of an enemy, or to an enemy's port, I should say, but also something that could stop a slave trader, chase it down, or stop a smuggler. Well, these two ships are ideal, thinks one officer, Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, as well as his brother-in-law, Commodore Matthew Calverth Perry, to become a sail training opportunity, a school at sea, if you would, for these boys, but with a mix not only of learning before the mast, as they would call it, but also the opportunity to learn to be better men as they grow up, because as a social reformer, Captain Mackenzie will not have alcohol on that ship. He will stop all sorts of other practices as well, particularly one that's known as the boom cover trade. And that is where a ship like that, you have these yards, these masts, these extra pieces of the ship's rig that are kept stowed on the deck, and you cover them with canvas. And that little cubby hole, if you will, is the perfect place for men and boys to get together on such ships. We know about this because there are diaries and records, sometimes speaking in code, that talk about the boom cover trade. Now, this is something that Captain Mackenzie cannot abide and will not have. So he makes sure that he gets the right officers when the Secretary of the Navy says, yes, we'll assign these two ships to be sail training, and you take command of the Somers. The Somers, when it sails, has a crew of officers, some of them young, untested, and many of them family members or friends of Captain Mackenzie. We could go on and on about Mackenzie, but I think that's another conversation. Just to say that the man these days would be seen as a prude, a moralist, and also a captain who had never really commanded at sea, with a group of younger officers, all of whom have a family connection or a friendship, and who are also, for the most part, untested, and then a group of boys, many of them so-called sweepings of the street, who come on board, as well as a group of older, jaded sailors. What could go wrong? Well, what goes wrong is Philip Spencer. Philip is the son of that Secretary of War. He has grown up coddled and cared for. He is the youngest in the family because his younger sibling had died. His mother adores him. His older siblings have left. He's turning 19. He's already an alcoholic. He's already nearly been thrown out of the Navy. And he was only put in the Navy when his father forced him to do so, to try to make a man out of him, to get him to straighten up. And is assigned to the Somers because back in Rio de Janeiro on another Navy ship, he'd managed to nearly get into a fight. And by the way, he'd already assaulted a couple of naval officers and nearly broke one man's jaw. But he never got really into any big scrape because, after all, he was the son of a prominent man. He shows up on Somers now. And interestingly enough, because just earlier, as he was leaving Rio de Janeiro, another ship to be brought home to face charges, his last comment yelled across a pier to a friend was, God damn the Navy and God damn that flag. God damn admirals, and so on and so forth. Not an easy kid. So here he shows up with Captain Mackenzie and all of those officers, a tight-knit circle. And here's this kid that nobody wants, particularly not Captain Mackenzie. The Voyage of the Somers, which is a sail training cruise across the Atlantic to the coast of Africa to bring dispatches or orders to a ship engaged in patrolling that coast to stop illegal slave trade, turns into the voyage from hell. For Spencer, for Mackenzie, and others. Now, Spencer breaks all the rules. He brings alcohol on board. He serves it to the boys. He brings cigars. He throws coins. He mocks the captain behind his back. Alexander Slidell Mackenzie is his name, and he's very proud of that. To which Spencer notes to one other officer, you know, how more appropriate it would be if his initials actually were not ASM, but ASS. What a damned old granny. What an old fool. What a humbug. Now, that phrase, made famous by Ebenezer Scrooge, really means somebody that's a fraud. Well, it all comes to a head when he confides to another crew member, asking him in the night, do you fear death? Have you ever killed a man? And then confides a tale in which he and others are going to seize the ship, turn it into a pirate vessel, roam the seven seas, and kill Captain Mackenzie and those who would not join him, including a number of the younger boys who, as the small fry, only eat the bread. Well, the man he confides to, Purser James Wales, ultimately approaches one of the officers, who tells Captain Mackenzie, and that's when everything goes bad. As Mackenzie first hears it, he doesn't really believe it, but as he keeps looking into this, he begins to feel strongly, he's convinced that there is a plot. They search Spencer, they find nothing, but in his chest, they find in a box where he kept a razor, a list of names and a plan written in Greek that seems to confirm that he is plotting something. Interestingly enough, there are names of those who are going to participate in his alleged mutiny who aren't really on the ship. Perhaps these are other names. Anyway, the captain hastily convenes a group of his officers. They talk to people, they speak about this. A lot of Spencer's bad behavior. He was seen up in the foretop getting tattooed. He's having a very close relationship, another one of the boys, who is likely Spencer's chicken, a very unkind term for a younger boy being sexually used by an older boy, and so on. So, rather quickly, without really the cover of the law, if you will, but the captain's authority is absolute on a ship, the officers find Spencer, as well as two other crew who are thought to have been consorting with him, Cromwell and Small. And Cromwell had been the captain's enforcer. He'd been the one who'd been flogging these boys, because that's the other part of this story, is that for any breach of discipline, other than for Spencer, who as an officer couldn't be, boys were regularly being flogged and whipped. 246 accounts of this happening on the Voyage of Summer. Captain Mackenzie's clearly a disciplinarian, but he's also a guy who's crammed on a 100-foot-long ship with over 100 other people. There's no room. And you've got teenage boys with hormones run wild. You've got the prominent son of a prominent man who's stirring things up and mocking the captain and his authority. And so, whether or not Spencer's plan was really sort of an elaborate version of what today we might call his own fantasy football, where he creates his own team, plots it out, writes it out in Greek because he'd gone to school and had been part of a fraternity, and he thought that that language would keep it safe. He miscalculated. It was just a joke, sir, he said when he was arrested. It is a joke on a forbidden subject that may cost you your life, says Mackenzie. And so, the next day, on that morning, as they convene that court-martial and as they move through it through the day, just as evening's about to fall, Spencer, Cromwell, and Small stand there, hoods over their heads, nooses around their necks. Don't tell my mother, says Small. Cromwell gave his best to his wife and opined that he was innocent. Spencer apologized for what he'd gotten them all into. And then, with a quick order, they were run up. Every boy was told to grab the rope and, at pistol point, raced across the deck and yanked those three bodies into the air, legs lashed, hoods over their heads. They kicked and struggled and then died and then were laid down onto the deck, washed, sewn into the hammocks, other than Spencer, who was put into a wooden coffin and committed to the deep. When Somers arrived in New York a few days later, the news broke like a thunderclap. It filled the national news. It was an affair to remember. It was a scandal, ultimately. Because while there were those who thought at first that Captain Mackenzie had done the right thing, think, said the newspapers, what would happen if one of these armed ships of our Navy had been taken over by pirates and started attacking vessels coming to and from New York Harbor? Think what that would mean, particularly if some of our wives and daughters would have to consent to become the brides of pirates. A euphemism, if ever. But also the loss to trade and the indignity of having a U.S. Navy ship turned pirate. But then questions start to come up. Was this really just a joke? Had the captain exceeded his authority? John Canfield Spencer, the Secretary of War, thought so, and he wrote a damning letter in the national press. This scandal did not go away. Captain Mackenzie ultimately had to face a court of inquiry and then a court martial himself. If he had failed in the court martial, after the court of inquiry found him not guilty, the court martial could very well have seen him condemned to death, but that did not happen. Captain Mackenzie was acquitted, but never again would he be given sole command of a ship. He remained on the beach, as they say, writing, he was an author, until finally recalled to service during the war with Mexico. As for Somers, it became known as a cursed ship, a terrible ship, a stain on the name of the Navy. It no longer was a sail training ship. In fact, one of the biggest results of all of this was that it was decided no more training like this We need a national academy. We need a school. And thence lies the origins of what would become the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. Somers lived on in infamy until it sank. And as it sank off the coast of Mexico, caught by a squall in 1846, and went to the bottom with a number of its crew, what was thought by many was, at last, it had gone to the devil. Indeed, one of the officers had said that when he joined the ship, he was told, "Damn bad luck follows her since the mutiny. She's caused, haunted." And one night in a storm, the crew refused to go aloft. He says, "Don't you see them, sir? Don't you see them there? Spencer, Cromwell, and Small. They're up there in the rigging and they're laughing at us." He said, "I didn't know what to really say." He didn't know how to really deal with this. He thought perhaps it had just been a play of the light, but for a moment he thought maybe he did see something there. But in the morning, as he talked to the captain of the foretop, the petty officer who had said no to that, he said, "That's fine, sir. There's things that you gentlemen do not see." Somers, cursed, a ghost ship. Somers, sight of a mutiny or of a captain who exceeded his authority and panicked because he was on a vessel full of rowdy young boys without enough authority, without even Marines to help guard him, as most naval ships would have, and matters got out of hand. They still debate this. They still talk about this. And in that, I think what we find when we look at a story like Somers is not only the connection to that which we've heard about, Herman Melville, Billy Budd, Mutiny, the Naval Academy, famous naval officers, wars, ultimately what we see, whether we're down there in the dark with the oozy weeds above us twisting, as I've been as an underwater archaeologist, whether you're reading the accounts and seeing in those words and in the emotions that lie in those words, events that mirror that same type of argument that we have today. Whether you view it through the lens of the newspapers and how they got it right and didn't get it right back at the time, what you see is that indeed that which is past is prologue. We oftentimes relive history, but it's also important, if we are to relive history, that we also confront it and look at it with all of the facts before us. What I've sought to do, and what I think I have done in this book, is share more of that. And I've not minced my words in the book in any way, shape, or form. I've not put much in the way of opinion. But what I have done is sort of ripped the veil away in some cases to speak frankly and bluntly about what was happening on that vessel. And while not graphic, certainly giving you a sense of life before the mast and how it would drive a man like Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, the captain of the Somers, a bit mad, and why it was a perfect setting and a stage for an epic clash between two very different personalities, where ultimately, wherever it had played out, somebody had to die.